So what inspired you to write this book?
Well, I'd previously written a biography of Jimmy Reid, and obviously researching Jimmy's entrance into the Communist Party, some of the people who'd looked at Willie Gallagher, some of the heroes that he had admired of the ILP, led me to looking back at the events of 1919 that had obviously affected his family and affected him, and it is a significant event.
So what gave rise to the Battle of George Square?
Well, it had been building up. It was actually the culmination of a week of strike, where there had been a strike principally in the engineering sector, but it looked as if it could be spreading. It was causing concern to the authorities, and people here had been gathering. As it was, I think the real outcome of the riot was an overreaction by the police, and whilst I've been a supporter of the police in Glasgow as the Justice Secretary, this was most certainly not Glasgow Police's finest moment.
There seems to be a kind of ugly backdrop of issues leading up to it, such as rent strikes and the fear that a lot of these mobilised troops were coming home with no jobs. So can you give us a wee bit of background into the issues around it?
Well, the strike was for a 40-hour week, and that didn't come about because people were simply wanting reduced hours, although they would be entitled to them. The average in the engineering sector before had been 54 hours. But with the 2.5 million men being demobilised from the army, with people remembering unemployment and the hunger that went with it, there was a concern that unemployment would come back. And so there was a desire to reduce hours that would have increased the number of people in work. So the strike was arguably for the right social reasons. But it also came about in a city that was very politicised. There had been rent strikes because this was the second city of the empire. But poverty stopped it. Some of the conditions faced in housing were frankly intolerable. The level of infant mortality is something that we probably consider now third world. So that was a backdrop in a city that had a radical tradition, and the 40-hour week was simply a desire to try and alleviate a return to oppressive conditions.
How far back does the radical tradition go in Glasgow, would you say?
I think it goes back to the French Revolution. When the French Revolution occurred in 1789, it awoke a consciousness not just in Scotland or in France, but across the whole of Europe and the world. And that happened here, and Thomas Muir in the 1790s from Bishop Briggs led the way. Others came on and it followed through. We had the 1820 Rising, that will be the bicentenary next year, that saw almost a general strike in the west of Scotland, and a cotton spinner strike in 1837. So there was a deep radical tradition as well as a very strong labour movement, because throughout the First World War the city of Glasgow, and indeed Clydeside, was pivotal to the war effort in terms of munitions and for both army and navy, but there had been a spectre of militancy, and that concerned the establishment.
There was much talk from the government, they feared a Bolshevik revolution. Do you think there was much of an appetite for that in Glasgow?
No, I don't think there ever was going to be a Bolshevik revolution. It obviously came at a time when that was in the backdrop, because the Red Army was fighting in Poland, and indeed the British, along with others, were fighting within what's now the Soviet Union. And the Secretary of State did call it a Scottish Bolshevik revolution, but it really wasn't. The strike in many ways came about by accident. Those who were most militant for it probably didn't expect that it was going to come about, so it came about to some extent by accident rather than, although it did have some design. Equally, the authorities were ready for it. So it was a significant event. It shouldn't be underplayed, but it was never going to be a Bolshevik revolution.
Can you paint a picture for us of how the events unfolded that day?
Well, people were gathering here because the Lord Provost had undertaken to get in touch with the government to see if there could be a settlement to the strike. And there was anywhere between 20 to 40,000 people gathering, more arriving by the minute because they were waiting to hear from a delegation, including John Wheatley, who was in there as a councillor, David Kirkwood, who was one of the more important leaders from Bridgemoors, and Gallagher was speaking here. And it seemed that what happened is that as a tram that used to run here turned into George Square, an unemployed, or a striker, pulled the communication cord. That caused a fight between him and a soldier who was on, and it spilled out onto the street. Now, when the fight spilled out onto the street, people were no doubt jostled, and it seemed that the police viewed this and were encouraged by the chief constable to frankly lash out at bystanders. And initially the crowd moved away because the police were lined up in front of the civic chambers there. The crowd were attacked by the police and moved in. And of course, as often happens in these things, The crowd soon gathered. These were working men, some were ex-soldiers. They were angry with some justification because people were being bloodied and beaten, including strike leaders, and they returned. And to be fair to say, the police probably got bested, if we could put it that way.
And can you describe the events following the battle in terms of military presence in Glasgow, all sorts of things?
Well, there were running fights up, North Frederick Street, along Cathedral Street, as police and strikers fought. Sadly, some people who had nothing to do with the strike simply used it as an opportunity to loot, so that shops in Gordon Street were involved. The army had been put on standby because the War Cabinet had been monitoring the situation, so concerned had they been. Troops were ready, and at lunchtime troops were coming in from Edinburgh and coming down from the Highlands, and so by the evening troops were arriving here. I think it would be fair to say an eerie calm developed over the city. There was obviously glass strewn, broken windows hanging about, and the army came in. They turned George Square basically into a fortified camp. They immediately went and put troops outside the power stations, because what really concerned the authorities would have been the loss of power from Pinkston Power Station, because that would have brought the city grounding to a halt. So I think it was an eerie calm. The strikers knew that the authorities were rounding them up. Some were already under power, and obviously most people, I think, were just probably bemused by what had happened and were wondering what was going to happen next.
But in the end, did it help foster change within the industries for the workers?
Well, change did come about. Hours were reduced not to 40 hours, they came about to 47 hours. To be fair, that was being negotiated across the thing. So that wasn't necessarily won by the strike, but the strike did see the workers go back with their heads held high. They returned not limping in, felt they'd achieved their aims or goals to some extent. I think the real outcome came in 1922 with the election then. That saw a landslide for the Independent Labour Party. They took 10 out of the 15 seats here in Glasgow. They won elsewhere, not just in Clydeside but in Scotland. And that had been partly delivered, I think, by the strike, but also partly driven by the rent strike, because as important in the history, the radical history of Glasgow, was the action by women in particular in the rent strike in 1916 as it was by the industrial workers in 1919.
How much would you say the Red Clydeside legacy carries through to modern Scotland?
Well, I think it's important. We still look at some of what we call Wheatley housing that was brought in by John Wheatley as a Labour minister in the 1920s. And if we were building houses as good as that, we wouldn't have the housing crisis that we have at the moment, and many people would probably have a far nicer home, or indeed would have a home that they badly desire. So there is a legacy there. I think there's things that we should probably look back and try and recover, because there was a great community spirit, there was great community activism. The strength of the ILP wasn't just their political representation in Parliament, it was how they operated across their city, with everything from socialist choirs to socialist Sunday schools, where they worked. They were from the community, they were rooted in the community, and they represented the community. But I think Scotland was made a better place by what John Wheatley, Tom Johnston, all these others who went into power, Patrick Dolan, achieved, both in municipal Glasgow but also in wider Scotland. And indeed the contribution by the likes of Maclean and Gallagher. They were brave men who opposed a war that I think we saw with some validity. Gallagher stood out against the Spanish Civil War when that came about and spoke out in support of the Republican government. So we shouldn't forget their legacy. There were things wrong with it, there were things that they would change, but they made Scotland and Glasgow a better place.
What do you think these leaders would say today about the current political situation in the wake of Brexit and a potential second independence referendum?
Well, I think they'd be calling for greater unity, certainly on the left. Although there were later seen as disputes between Maxton and the ILP and Labour, between Gallagher and Maclean, actually in 1919 and through the war, although they had different perspectives about how socialism should evolve, they actually stood united. When the crunch came on the 31st of January, they stood shoulder to shoulder, both Wheatley along with Gallagher and Kirkwood. Gallagher ran to Kirkwood's aid when he was beaten by police.